No. Anyway, I'd like to introduce Mark and have Mark come up and talk about his book, and hopefully we'll have a lot of interaction. People, I hope, have questions, and Mark has answers and has a particular passion for prison reform because he lived it, he knows it. So, Mark Roseman, thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. And thank you for all coming out today. It's not the best day to come out, but I appreciate you being here. I really do. I'm glad to see that some have read the book, and the others that are here probably had some interest that brought you here. As my topic is, the umbrella topic is prison reform and what that means to people. And it means different things to everyone. When I started as a lawyer, it didn't mean anything to me, prison reform. I was a civil litigation attorney, not dealing with the criminal element. But as I got more experienced with the system and ended up doing time myself, I felt a passion to write. I felt a need to write about my experience and to say something about it, because what I was seeing inside was wrong. There were a lot of things that are happening to the 160,000 prisoners in California and the 2.3 million people in the United States collectively. We imprison more people in the United States than any other country, including China, including Russia. There's something wrong with our system. And my book is sort of a composite. It's broken down into three areas generally. And if you read it, you'll recognize them. It's how I got there, more about me as a litigator, a little bit about what Ruth was talking about. I represented victims of childhood sexual abuse, and I had a passion for that because these people were really harmed. These were children who later on in their years had memories surface about their sexual abuse, and they were horribly damaged. So the book starts with a little bit about that, my background being from New York, being a Jewish kid from Long Island. It wasn't in the script for me to end up in a California state prison. So the story is about how that happened, how that occurred to me. And I take responsibility. I made decisions, as we all do in our lives. We make decisions about relationships, about business, about what our priorities are. And I discuss that in the book in some context. I also talk at the beginning, the first 3 chapters, about how things kind of went on the skids and how they unraveled and how I ended up facing the California judicial system, the criminal system. I talk about my partnership with my ex-wife, and I talk about my trust in her. She was an accountant, forensic accountant, and she was handling the financial side of the firm. It's not an excuse on my part. I was a partner in the firm, but I didn't work day to day with the assets of the firm. I work with the human relations. I work with dealing with our employees and making sure that the firm was running very well. And then there was this unraveling. The unraveling was waking up in the morning one Sunday and seeing that my law firm is under investigation by the Orange Police Department. And I talk about my feelings and my emotions about that and what that did to me and how that was very, very crushing. And the book then continues to where I pled guilty to 10 felonies for, the crime was, I think I try to forget some things. Grand theft is what it was. And then what happened after that? The guts of the book is the middle of the book, which is, how did I survive the prison experience? Because I'll tell you, it's an upside-down parallel universe out there. And I went in when I was 54 years old, white guy, like I said, a Jewish guy, And I was told two pieces of advice, actually by someone who had been in prison several times, a Hispanic man in the Orange County Jail. And he said to me, "First rodeo?" I said, "Yeah, how'd you know?" He didn't even answer. He didn't have to. He said, "Let me give you two pieces of advice. One is, be a ghost. And the second was, do the time, don't let the time do you." So I said, okay. Now we're in this holding cell which is built for 40 people, and there's probably 90 people in it. And it's loud, and there's no oxygen, and it's warm. There's one toilet facility that didn't work so well. Didn't smell so good in there, and I'm learning from this man. I'm hearing him. He's giving me words of wisdom. I said, "What do you mean be a ghost?" He said, "Don't be seen." What do you mean don't be seen? Don't look at anyone. Don't challenge them. If you look at them, you're challenging. If you don't know the person, don't look at him. I said, okay, what do you mean do the time, don't let time do you? He said, be aware of the time, but don't think about the time. Because if you do, it will take you over, and it will drive you crazy. And he was really right about that. You may have seen Shawshank Redemption, the prison movie. It took place in Maine, where a new inmate came in, big strapping guy. They put him in the first night, and they ended up crying for his mother, if you remember that scene, and he was then beaten to death by the guards. That's not so far from the truth. It can get to you. You have to have a mindset that says, I'm going to survive this, and I'm going to come out stronger. And that's what I did. The third part of the book has to do with how my training as an attorney helped me survive. I brought with me certain knowledge and assets that I could help the men inside. And again, without looking at them, being a ghost, word gets around if you're there to help others of any race. And the racism in California prisons is palpable, it's thick. And I read about that. But I was able to, by listening to people, non-judgmentally, give them advice, not legal advice necessarily, but life advice on how to make it through the system themselves. And that, the word got around. So listening, having some legal skills, I did a lot of immigration law ahead of time. Before I did civil litigation, I did family law. I had all the basics, so I could give people information and help them along the way. The last part of the book is also my transformation. I did not start writing this book as a prison reform book. It was going to be a, let me tell you about my experience, take from it what you want. But over the decade it took me to write the book, had a lot of awarenesses that I wanted to bring to the attention of the public. And that's the most important part of this book, is how I transformed, how I remained alive, how I came out stronger and better. And that's basically the story. And I'm interested to hear from people who have read the book or who have some specific questions about the book or prison reform issues. Because generally when I talk to a group, I'm structured, I have a PowerPoint going, and I didn't think that would be appropriate for a book club like this. So I'd like to turn it back to the audience about questions, anything I've said up to this point, or anything about the book. Ruth.
Is there any rehab going on in prison?
Great question. I didn't see any. I was at Ironwood State Prison, which is out in Blythe, California, which sounds like it sounds. It feels like it is. It's the desert. It's the Sonora Desert. It's very hot. However, I now write a blog. It comes out weekly. And part of my blog is to pick up issues that I didn't know about that have to do with prison reform. And one that I just wrote about, it will be published in a couple of weeks, has to do with a rehabilitation program with inmates being taught to train dogs to become service dogs for the public. And you probably have some recognition about that. There is a smattering of rehabilitation, but because of the overcrowdedness of the prisons, it's very far from one-on-one. And I've been out 11 years, and I never saw any rehab.
When you get out of prison, it's my understanding that they give you $200 and clean shoes or something, and maybe a bus ticket, and you had resources and you had friends outside, and you have an education, you have stuff to fall back on. How are people expected to do anything other than end up back in prison? That was sort of my question.
Well, you're absolutely right. You're given $200 cash, no bus ticket, clean clothes, and a pat on the butt. And normally the guards say, "See you next time," because they know you're coming back. It's such a good question. With the parole system, you're paroled back to the county where your crime was committed. And if it's in the inner city, LA, San Francisco, Oakland, anywhere in the state, you're back there. And you come out with no skills other than what you've learned in prison. And what you've learned in prison is probably how to cook better methamphetamine. You've got the formula because you're being housed with men that are in there for doing the same thing. I would say 90% of the men that I met who were serving time were doing time for drug-related issues, not just using, but selling, and in big quantities. So that's part of the recidivism problem. You put your finger right on it. There is nothing happening on the outside. Now, I've written about it in my blogs. The American Psychological Association has a model program to have psychologists treat men and women 6 months before they go back to the streets to help them figure out who they are, to get jobs, become productive, and then 6 months after they're out. But it's just a model program. It's not in place. But those are the kind of things I'm interested in because those are so badly needed, those kind of programs. Yes?
The three strikes you're out law, hasn't that really added to the overcrowding in prison?
It did, and it was overturned. It's Prop 47 in 2013. But I met dozens of young men in prison for 3 strikes. If you're not familiar with it, it was if you have 2 felonies and a third crime that didn't necessarily have to be a felony, you were there for life. And it was, so I met what I call a lot of hollow men who just, you looked at them and there was nothing going on in their eyes. And these were mostly young men in their 20s, early 30s, who just had no purpose in life. And if you're in prison for life, you have nothing to lose. So they didn't go along with the program. And they were very difficult. And then they found themselves in the shoe. And the shoe is, it's where they put you in a cell by yourself in your underwear. And there's a hole in the floor for the bathroom. And there's no creature comforts. And you get a bag of food thrown into you about 3 times a day. Solitary confinement is what it is. So they're constantly getting into a system where life is meaningless to them. And many of them think about, I might as well kill somebody and get out of here. And so that's 3 strikes. But it's been overturned, and that has resulted in the release of many thousands of men whose sentences have been reevaluated. Yes?
The hearing, and they talk about the 3 times out.
Yeah.
And they talk about an example of a convicted young fellow that didn't have a prison history before and everything, ended up for life.
Right.
So it's still there.
Well, let me say this. I'm not here to say that prison should be burned and closed, and Joan Baez's song, and I love Joan Baez, but I don't subscribe to that that theory. There are some bad people in prison. I met some bad people in prison. I met people that would just as soon slash your throat than talk to you. And that is chilling. I'm not exactly sure of the case you're talking about, but our prison system is in place to protect society. It's not in place to punish society. I see our society's prisons as punitive. Okay, the rehabilitation question, it doesn't happen. It's punitive. So if someone does commit a crime and they're convicted by a court of law and they are sentenced by a judge according to the guidelines, then he or she should be doing that time. And if it is life, then it's life.
So it has not been a change at all in that law.
You're talking about the federal system?
The three times out.
No, the three.
Because for some, in this case that we're talking, in many cases of young people, that because they were selling drugs and they didn't kill anybody, you know.
Sure.
The punishment doesn't fit the crime at all. And that is
right. I think you're talking about the war on drugs, which began in Bush II administration, and so those harsh sentences are now under scrutiny now to reduce them. You've all seen Black is the New Orange, and what happened with the inner cities. It was very easy to go into inner city and come out and get a group of normally black men and set them up, take them out, convict them, take them away from their families, take them away from their children. There's a ripple effect. And those kind of sentencing guidelines still exist in this country on the federal level. The 3 strikes you're out was state of California. That has been overturned in 2013. It was a Proposition 47, overturned that. People of California finally got it. And what stronger and better testimony to prison reform is that? The ballot. Now, there were 3 very important ballots on this last election, one of which was to do away with the prison system in California. Well, not the prison system, with the death penalty. Privatization is another issue, but the death penalty. Then there was a countervailing proposition that said, let's not just keep it, but let's expedite the process. Let's make it faster, because it takes 10 to 20 years to go through the appellate process. Guess which one won? Well, only one could. The people voted to keep the death penalty in California and expedite the process. Well, depending on where you stand on the death penalty, which is an emotional issue, that was the decision of the people. They could have gone the other way, but it empowers the people to have a say through the ballot box. And if you look at my blogs, and they're on the website, I talk a lot about these issues. People just don't know, and I'm here to help educate. Just to sensitize you a little bit. If you leave here today just thinking a little bit more about prison reform, when you hear a story on the radio, or you hear someone talking about prison reform, or you see anything in the media, you're a little bit more educated, I hope, after today.
Can you talk about privatization and what it costs to keep somebody in prison for a year?
Right. Let me talk about what privatization is. We have the federal government, we have state governments. Each state has its own penal system. So California is going to be different than New Jersey, Arkansas. They're all different, but they're all protected, or the inmates are protected by state law, and then on top of that, federal law. There's also the federal penal system, which is separate and apart for federal crimes. My crime was a state crime. I went to state court. Privatization came around because of overcrowding in state prison systems and in the federal system, especially deportation holds. There are hundreds, thousands of men and women all over the country that are in these private prisons that don't have Constitution protections. And I can talk all day about that. And what happened is being in the country without papers. I used to do a lot of immigration work, and people talk about illegals. Well, illegals are sick birds. These are undocumented people. It's now been criminalized to be in this country if you don't have your papers and you're put on hold. So what's happened is there are these cottage industries, and again, I do blog about it, that are making millions of dollars on having contracts with states and the federal government to take their overload that they can't handle. Men and women in California are shipped out to Tennessee. And no notice. Roll up. And I've been rolled up when I had to be moved. Roll up, you're out of here. You can't tell your family. No one, how they can't go see you in Tennessee. But it's a financial balancing. Now, President Obama has rescinded private prisons. And now it's one of his executive orders that the next administration can do away with. But he saw the abuse to human beings in the deportation scenario, and he changed that. And that will take a couple of years to filter down. California has yet to say we're not going to send prisoners to private prisons. But it's a big prison reform issue that you've highlighted.
Did they get any representation?
No.
They just get put there and forgotten.
No, you've hit on a real good point. Once you're in and convicted, you don't have any rights. You lose your Fourth Amendment rights to search and seizure. They can come anytime they want in the night, go through all your stuff, read your mail. The 13th Amendment, I've written about that. It's called the 13th Amendment screws. And what I mean by that is everybody here believe that there's no slavery in the United States under the 13th Amendment? No. There's an exception for convicted felons. So I was a slave in the California prison system. I was paid 9 cents an hour to work in the library. And then I got a raise to 11 cents.
How do you score such a cushy job?
Well, they knew I was literate, but I couldn't make a big deal out of it. And there were four shifts, and each race had one individual to do a shift. And the 4 races in the California prisons are whites, Hispanics, blacks, and others. Others are people with long names, last names that end in vowels, that they didn't know what to do with. Samoans, Polynesians, Asians, seriously, they were others. And they hung with the blacks. And the Hispanics and the whites hung together. So they could do sports together, they could exercise together, they could sit and talk and eat together. But I could never eat with a black man. I could never eat with an other man. And I talk about the rules of the game in the book. It's quite alarming, quite alarming. I forgot what the question was.
How did you score such a cushy job in the library?
What I did was I volunteered for many, many weeks on my own and just went to the library, talked to men, got to be known, let the lieutenant on the yard know that I wanted the job. And when the next white man, Caucasian man, left, I was a natural for the position. So it was, on my part, I took the initiative. And the best thing about the library, is there was a bathroom there. You could close the door. You could actually close the door, and no one was around. And I do talk about bathroom etiquette in the book, and I won't go into too much detail here, but it's a real thing. There's no privacy, none. Imagine that. There's no separations between stalls. It's just there. It's lovely.
It's to dehumanize you.
It does. It's to punish you. That's the penal side of it. I talk about humiliation and shame and how that's used. And humiliation and shame are huge emotional, human sentiments and feelings. Shame is the strongest. Someone that's shamed looks like this. And that's what they want you to do. That way that you're easy to manage and handle.
That segues a little into my question. You talked about the Stanford experiment and
Yeah.
how those given positions of power come to
Yeah.
abuse their power. And it's a twofold question. How prevalent really was that abuse of power by the guards? And is there any system in place to monitor the guards or monitor that abuse of power?
Thank you. It's very persuasive, very, very pervasive. Guards are not trained to deal with inmates. The profile of a typical CO, and I use the term lightly, correctional officer, and I'm not being mean, I'm talking from experience, is they are there to keep you quiet. They're there to make sure when you're counted, you're there. They are there to enforce the rules and regulations of the yard when it's convenient for them. And they're usually fallouts from police academies that didn't make it. Also, they're willing to work out in the desert. You know where the prisons are, even in California. They're not in really the hot spots. You go down the 5, Avalon's down there. You don't want to live down in Avalon. But they're willing to do that, and they're paid very well. So it's prevalent. We used to call them badge happy. Watch out for this one. And the women who are on the men's yards are just as bad as the men. There were exceptions. Absolutely, there's always exceptions. One female guard, I'll just tell you a story. She was going through a divorce, and she knew I had practiced law, and she kind of liked me in terms of, Roseman, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. And so I told her my stories, and she said I was thinking with my wrong head, and she would always put things like that together. She worked in San Quentin as a volunteer, so she was tough as nails. But I ended up, after hours, preparing her paperwork for her divorce. Now, both of us could have been slammed. That's called familiarity of staff. I got to know where she lived. I knew about her bank accounts. I knew about her family. I knew her phone number. And likewise, she was getting too close with me, and she would pay me with these frozen pocket sandwiches that you put in the microwave. And let me tell you, it was like manna, because it had taste, it had seasoning, it was hot. But my point is, rules get broken on both sides. They also get broken by, excuse me, COs bringing drugs onto the yard. You can get any drug that you want in prison. I have seen it. I have had a toke on a marijuana cigarette because I just needed to get away. So I've done that. It was peer pressure, but it was also my decision. There are nurses, female nurses, that have something about this physical attraction to men that are incarcerated. And they're walked off the prison yard very often for being much too familiar with the inmates. So we're still talking about human beings in a confined situation, and almost anything can go. Have I answered your questions?
Is there any training or any overseeing of the correction officers?
That's right. There is. There's a process, paper process, where you can bring to the attention of the warden and the warden's lieutenants of incidences that have occurred. For example, there was one CO who was in charge of getting men ready for leaving on their discharge date. And the guy must have had narcolepsy because he was always asleep. And men were really excited about, hey, I'm going to go see whatever his name was, and I'm getting my paperwork going. And he just didn't do his job. So as one of the literate ones on the yard, there's a form that you can fill out to bring this to the attention of the yard, of the administrator, and maybe something would happen, and maybe it wouldn't. there was a lot of lip service giving to us. I was the secretary of the MAC on our yard, Men's Advisory Council, who once a month met with the warden and his designates to talk about health issues, talk about sanitation issues, talk about they haven't changed the filters in the swamp pump in 12 years. And unless you bring it to the attention, they don't care. And then again, they don't necessarily do anything. It's called unctuosity. It's unctuous. They say, good, oh, very good, yeah, thank you for bringing it to our attention. Go back to your yard, and you're done. So it was a very frustrating process.
What do you expect to happen to the prisons if the state makes it more comfortable for these guys? I mean, it is a punitive system, and we want them to not want to go back.
Yeah.
So it seems to me there's a real gray area there where some is necessary, but obviously not abusive too, but at the same time. And my second question is, isn't there prisons where, like, I would consider your crime a white-collar crime, where you wouldn't be with murderers and, you would be separated?
Yeah. Your first question, I'm a little stuck on the word comfortable. Yeah. What you mean by that? If what you mean by that is that you're fed at a standard that's, excuse me, the caloric amount that you're being fed is enough to keep you going, and it is never. And you have Samoan men who are 400 pounds that are living on a 1,500 calorie. That's why we have to define our terms of comfort. I prefer to use the word humane and anticipate human needs. And mental health is a huge issue in prison. I mean, I went through screenings several times, and I did the Rorschach test, and I said I wasn't suicidal or homicidal, and okay, next. And that was about it. It wasn't much more than that. So part of being humane or comfortable with getting people to feel good about themselves was just contraindicated for putting someone in prison, because you want to shame them. So that's why I'm hung up on that term. If you reduce the overcrowding, so you don't have men sleeping in 3 tiers, first, second, and third, and the guy in the middle has about 3 inches to the top of the bunk, what is that telling that man? What is he being told by the system? He's being told that he is a chattel. He's something to be counted. He is not a human being. So I think if there were programs, if there was rehabilitation, if they had something to do other than to figure out how to either escape or escape the system, I think that would be very helpful. And I'm talking in broad generalities, and I do talk more specifically in my blogs. In terms of your second question, which just slipped my mind.
My mind too. What did I ask?
Okay, why I was not in like a Martha Stewart situation, and I was, well, very simple. Again, my crime was state. The state of California treats everybody the same. The federal system has a different system, and it does provide for looking at the severity of the crime, the victimization, and can put a Martha Stewart in a situation where she's pretty much free to roam her yard whenever she wants to, and can even meet with the press if she wants to. So they're 2 separate systems. The system in California and in most state prisons is paranoid. They are afraid. And they should be, because there's so many of the inmates there. And if they wanted to, there could be a flash uprising, and we call it a jumping off. And they could take over the yards. And we've seen that. I mean, look at Attica in 1971. I've written about Attica very recently. The conditions in Attica that caused that still exist in Attica, and they still exist in California. Getting back to the comfort, the inhumane treatment of men, and I'll say women also. There's one women prison in California, and I understand it's worse than men from the sexual predator sense of things. In men's prisons, it's machismo. You know, there are jokes if you drop soap in the shower and pick it up, but there's no one acting upon it. At least I never saw any of that. Yes.
The prison system is called the Department of Corrections, which is ironic because from what you're saying,
Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation.
Right, but wasn't there a time, I don't know if it was the 80s or something, where there was a trend to try to rehabilitate prisoners? I'm pretty sure that was tried and obviously given up. But there was also something on 60 Minutes a few months ago, and I apologize, I don't remember, but it was about a prison in another country. I don't remember if it was Germany.
Germany.
Yeah, that seemed to treat people as human.
Right.
And from what you describe, and I've certainly seen my share of movies and read my share of books,
Yeah.
from the moment you walk in, you're treated so badly that there's no chance of feeling human or being treated
Right.
human the way the system is now.
Well, you brought up a couple of good points. Yeah, when you're brought into a prison, you go through what's called a sally port, and the sally port is the entryway. You're strip searched. You just got off a prison bus, but you're strip searched, and I have details of that in the book, and it's completely humiliating. But like anything else, you get used to it. You know, okay, another strip search. Visitation, after a visitation with your family, strip search, you know, because your family may have given you some contraband. So it becomes a reality. The system in Germany, when they were highlighting a murderer who was going out on weekends to spend time with his family and was going to be getting out in a short period of time, I just sat and watched that like it was a cartoon. It didn't relate to me. It didn't relate. And the only thing I can point to is they must have many fewer inmates that they could actually work with these men to get them to the point where they don't have homicidal tendencies anymore and they are rehabilitated. But we're so far away from that because we're overloaded with men and women in prison. The question is, are other systems not dealing with drugs, the people addicted to drugs in prison as we are, meaning in the United States? I can speak to California. I can speak to watching men going through withdrawal for heroin right in front of my eyes, and no one does a thing. And purportedly that is extremely painful. They're on their side, prenatal position, moaning, crying for help. COs walking right by. They don't do anything. I saw no programs here in California that dealt with drugs. And boy, that's a big hole. Prison reform issue, exclamation point. Yes?
Was in prison here at Parks Air Force Base. Are you familiar with that situation? It was in all the magazines. It was one of those. Is anyone else familiar with that?
Was it Mark Milken? Was it Mark Milken?
Yes, I believe it was.
For a federal crime, for a SEC.
So it sounded like he almost had a country club experience at Parks Air Force
federal.
Base.
And yes, and I'm familiar with Michael Milken, and I'm familiar with some of the criminality behind him. But again, that's a federal system, and people can be bought off. And I mean, Joe Gotti lived in, until they took him to Alcatraz. John Gotti was living in like a luxury apartment in prison. And then warden said, can't have this. The press got a hold of that, and things changed. But again, we're talking about two separate systems. The set-off for state and federal, most people don't know this. And with state sentencing, you get good time credits. Like I was sentenced to 4 years, I did 2 because I was good. So you can get 50%. Federal, you do 85% of your time, and there's no good time beyond that. So if you're going to commit a crime, I'm just kidding, but there are differences in the system. I've talked to men who've been to federal. Food's much better, more access to food. Sometimes they have carpeting on the floor, unheard of in state.
Along that same line, not too long ago, there was publicity about a prison, I believe it was in Colorado.
Okay.
It was magnificent. I mean, it was floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a gym that was state-of-the-art. Are you familiar with that situation?
No, I'm not.
Okay, because it sounds like from what you're talking about,
Right.
perhaps a federal prison, too.
It sounds like a federal prison.
But looking at the pictures, I can't remember whether it was in a magazine or Vanity Fair or what, but it was very, what shall I say, disillusional to me to realize, my goodness, how can criminals have this kind of life? There's no point in wanting to get out of that system with that kind of a life.
Well, and you bring a good point, and I'll just point out where the use of the word criminals in that context, we have to get past that. I mean, they are criminals, and they're convicts, and they're inmates. But what I'm saying is the broad brush harms people. I mean, I was a victim of that. I was broad brushed with everything that I did wherever I lived. So we need, in prison reform, a paradigm shift a little bit to understand that maybe the men that you're talking about earned that privilege to do what they were doing. Maybe they were on some rehabilitative course. But I can tell you it's not fun when you lose your freedom, even if you have basketball and volleyball, which I had in our yard. It's still not fun. When you lose your freedom, it's like nothing else. It's a cliche. But when you actually lose your freedom, you're a different person. When you regain it, man, you appreciate your freedom. And you can, in most states, even vote. And I write a blog about that. Some states you cannot, never can. So,
How is California?
California is once you're off parole, you can vote. Vermont is if you're in prison, you can vote. I mean, that's how polemic that issue is. South Carolina, Virginia, you're never going to vote, even if you're off parole, even if you do wonderful things for society. So it's very politicized. So it's a good question. I just wanted to sensitize to your thinking, to be maybe more broad thinking about what's going on there, what are you seeing, but I understand the visceral response. I really do.
For example, can you tell us which prisons locally are federal and which are state? You know, there are several in the area, really.
Right. Well, you've got San Quentin, which is state. San Quentin is a level 4. That's where the death row is. You have Grass Valley, which is more south of here. You have, there's 23 of them, 33 prisons, so I can't name them all. There's one federal that I know that's, I think it's Fremont, which is a federal prison, but I don't know any others in this area. There's 33 states, state prisons all over our state. And there are movements to close them down, some of them down, to
So
save
there are
money.
more state than federal.
Oh, yes.
But how could they close them down if it's so overcrowded?
Well, the idea is to change the sentencing, which means they'll be in there shorter, and do like overturning with Prop 47, the 3 strikes law, which got a lot of men and women out of prison. But it's a problem. Yes.
What were your living conditions like, and also describe a typical day?
I had two general living situations. One was in a cell with another man, and then one was in a dormitory with 300 men in a dormitory that was built to house 150 men. Think of a big Costco. And in the middle is what's called the day room, which is where we ate, and there's stainless steel chairs and tables riveted to the floor. There are two TVs at the front of the day room. One's for the blacks and the others, one's for the whites and Hispanics, and they didn't always watch the same shows. So my typical day was you wake up to chow. You get up at 6:30, brush your teeth if you have time, and get out and you eat. You have chow, which they give you about 5 minutes to eat, and it's fast. Then you're out, you go back, there's a count, and every person is counted throughout the entire California prison system. If there's one off count anywhere in the state, you're locked down, and sometimes that would be part of my daily experience. It was like maddening. Usually someone that was in a hospital off campus, and there was no one that escaped when I was there. It was very hard to escape. And then there was a lot of free time. When I was on a dorm situation, there was a yard. I could walk the yard. I could only walk with people of my own race or Hispanics. There was a handball court and a volleyball court, the library, which I would visit. It was getting the day done. It was filling all my moments. It was letter writing. I wrote prolifically my letters and letters that came back to me that I've used as primary sources for the book. I did have there weren't many friends that I had inside, but I had acquaintances, guys that, I don't know, you probably know people like this. You like a certain part of that person, but the other part you really can't stand. So I would find that part of a person that either he had a sense of humor or he had a different outlook on life, but it was an uplifting experience, and I still have that friend who lives in San Diego. And you create like a prison bond. It's very interesting. It's almost like the military, because you're living together under attack all the time. And there weren't very many other diversions. Sometimes there was a movie. Sometimes there was a group called Kairos, which was a religious group that would come in on weekends and play music and talk about spirituality. Those were great. It was a break of the monotony, over and over. Everything happens the same. Every day. No classes. That's why the library was kind of like a laboratory for classes. I worked with men to get them the GEDs, and I was able to get 4 men the GEDs, and I'm very proud of that. And these were men that were hungry for rehabilitation. They were hungry for education. They knew that they needed it. When a man hits about 26, you women might agree or not agree, but they seem to start to mature. Maybe not.
49, I believe.
40, it's all right. 49.
Well, I really had read that it was 29, but
Oh, 29.
when the brain is actually more
Yeah.
fully developed.
Well, okay, so I've matured. They come in thinking one way, and a lot of men come out thinking, I really wasted time. I wasted so much of my life. I'm going to get out. I have a date. That's a term. Someone has a date means they're going to get out. Men that don't have dates, that's a life sentence. I'm going to get out. So what am I going to do with it? I don't know math. I don't know history. I need to get a job. And the GED program was not supported by the prison. It was supported by me and some other inmates who identified who could actually teach some subjects. So I did those kind of things. I kept busy because when you start feeling the time doing you, it hurts. And it hurts on weekends Friday nights, Saturday, Sunday, holidays. Christmas was very interesting inside prison. It was somber. There were some decorations, there were lots of cards that men had put out, but it was, I noticed men mostly walking with their heads down. They weren't uplifted by the fact that it was Christmas. The good thing about the holidays, and particularly Christmas, is we got more food. You had turkey, you had ham, it's all compressed stuff. But it had color and it had some flavor. And you got an extra 3 minutes to eat it. So you had 8 minutes to eat your Christmas meal. But it was very sobering. And it was those days, I'll be honest with you, where it hurt. It was like, man, I missed family. You know, we celebrated Hanukkah. I made friends with the Jewish chaplain on the yard. Very nice man. And I just loved seeing him. He had bright eyes. He would talk to me. He was from Chabad. If you know Chabad, they're black in the hat. He would walk on the yard, and it was an enigma. Like the men, they didn't know what to do with him. But I would have a conversation with the 2 other Jewish inmates, and every other word was not the F-bomb. And I write about that in the book, how the English language is just eviscerated inside prison. But he spoke clear, concise English, and it was a thrill. So my days were very eclectic and mixed up. A lot of letter writing, a lot of reading. I read books I wanted to read and never got to do, but I did in prison. And I keep notes on them. And I had occupational hazard as a lawyer to write down everything. So I did that. Primary source for the book are my journals that I kept. Yes?
Did you learn how to speak Spanish?
I improved my Spanish on the inside, yes, I did. However, man, that's a great question. When a group of men was speaking a foreign language or Spanish, or they were doing hand signals because gangs have signs, and they were wearing their colors, and they're speaking another language, that was a signal. You don't want to talk to these guys, something's coming down. So my antenna would go up based on the environment, based on what I was seeing, what I was hearing or not hearing. Because when there's going to be a jumping off, when there's going to be a riot on the yard, and I experienced several of them, and you're outside, there's this calm before the storm. It's eerie. And then, all of a sudden, something's going on over there where the guards can't see them directly. And it's scary. And as a white guy, if it was a white versus another race, I was supposed to get into the mix. And here I am, 54, 55 at the time. I didn't want to do that. But I was able to, through my work, get a pass from the woods, the white guys, that I didn't have to partake in any of the riots because I was too valuable in other respects. So that was another way I helped preserve myself. And there were guys my age or older that had to get into the fights, and if you didn't, they beat you up afterwards. They meaning your own race, because you're a weak link. And a weak link is someone who will rat. And a rat in prison is the last thing and the lowest thing you want to be. It's almost as low as a child molester. Okay. Yes.
So you touched a little bit about education,
Yeah.
which makes me think about, I know we don't have the funding for education. As far as before getting into prison, the kids are in junior high school. There used to be a program, I think it was in the 70s, that was introduced called Scared Straight.
Yes.
And I don't know what happened in that program, but my thought is to educate these kids, scare them straight, to mitigate some of the damages that can come in the future.
I agree with you, but I think there has to be a counterbalance. Scare them and then give them an opportunity.
Right, but not even scaring the kids that have committed a crime already, but just educating, not really scaring, but educating these kids. This is what really can happen to you. This isn't a joyride, and it's not a cushy place. And
my recollection of Scare Straight is they took place mostly in the inner city.
Yeah.
and they were usually African Americans or other people of color who they wanted to say, look at this, this could happen to you. But they didn't provide, beyond that, a safety net.
Right.
And a program, or a boys and girls program, or somewhere where they can, okay, I'm scared, what do? I don't want to become like that. A drug program, a prophylactic drug program to teach what drugs can do to your body. It was a half-cooked program.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there could be a lot done with something like that, and that's a great prison reform issue, and I think it should be happening in every state.
I agree, because education's a foundation for everything.
Education the biggest problem is breakdown of the family. The best way to get past that is self-esteem, building self-esteem,
right.
Education, self-worth.
Yeah.
Because you get none of that in prison. It's taken away. So if you don't have that to begin with, you're in a world that you feel comfortable with in prison. And then your family becomes all these fringe groups and the gangs. And the gangs do run the prison.
Yeah.
That's the topic of another book. But I'm actually leery of talking about that because they're so insidious. Just put it that way. Frightening.
So do you have any ideas whatsoever about programs that could be instigated to help the kids in the schools?
There's a program called POPS, P-O-P-S. They're located in Los Angeles, and I have some affiliation with it here. And it's an acronym that stands for essentially prison. Prison can hurt children, and I wish it was that an acronym. But it's for high school students who have loved ones in prison. And I know the founder, an amazing woman, who started this program with her husband, a teacher in Los Angeles. And it started out very small. They had invited them during lunchtime to come in to talk about this program. And 2 young girls came in, and when they saw each other, their response was, "Why are you here? Why are you here?" They didn't know that their parents, their fathers in this case, were incarcerated in prison. Huge. And that program developed to what it is now in lots of schools in Southern California, and there's one in Oakland, where young people get together and talk about it because they are secondary victims of this process. They've lost a parent, they've lost a loved one, they've lost a role model, they've lost someone that they can anchor onto, and they're lost. They're gone. And I met men in prison from LA in gangs who had never seen the Pacific Ocean. They live in this microcosm of hate and negativism. So there's so much social work to be done. There's so much mental health to be done. I advocate for one fewer aircraft carrier, and we can get a lot of this done, but our values are our values.
I know you said that you got out of prison 10 or 11 years ago.
Yeah.
So you got out before the advent of the iPhone and the iPad.
Yes.
Can they have any devices like that in prison now?
Can
Any
they or do they?
computers?
My friend that I alluded to, my Jewish friend, he had several rodeos. And after he got out and got back in and I was out, hey, dog, call me. He was calling me from a cell phone. I'd say, Mike, what are you doing? Don't worry about it. Yes, that didn't exist when I was there. And there's a movement for the prison system to crack down very heavily on it and jam the cell phone waves so they can't have the calls. And why is that? Well, you can set up a prison escape. I mean, you can set up a hit. You can put a kite out for somebody that you want whacked. I mean, communication by inmates is not always about, apple pie and good things. It's going to be a slant to it.
But how are you getting the phones in?
Visitation, guards will sell them. One trick is there are teams that clean the outside perimeter of the yard, and there are garbage disposals that they clean. Well, anybody can drop anything into one of these bags, pull it up, and anything could be in it. The big trick is, how do you get it back into the yard? And let's just say we all come with natural openings in our bodies. And you'd be surprised what you could be packing along the way. And that's the term, packing. And when you get on a yard, it's, what are you packing? They're looking for cigarettes. They're looking for syringes, and you can actually do that. They're looking tobacco, cigarettes, and any kind of contraband, of course, drugs, and coffee. And I can go in detail, but I don't want to. But use your imaginations, because bags don't always stay intact. I'm sorry, what was the question? Yeah, that's how they would do it. They would not let me near a computer, and there was a computer in the warehouse if I were to work in a warehouse, because they, meaning when I was screened, they were afraid of me, and because they knew my background, and they thought if I got near a computer, I could set the whole prison system, on riot stage. They just wouldn't let me near it. And they were afraid that I was going to be communicating with my co-defendant, my ex-wife, which wouldn't happen. But there's this paranoia, and it's like I talked about before. And it manifests in many different ways, and that's one of them. She did. Right. She ended up doing the same amount of time that I did. Her sentencing was different, but we have a son together, and unfortunately he's a victim of all this, and that's what I'm talking about. I know what it's like to have a child that loses a parent or both parents into the criminal justice system. There's no safety net for them. Yes?
How would the individual even have the funds to pay for a sex change? And that blew me away.
Well, that was probably donations from the outside, from probably the LGBTQ community that would be supportive of that. I mean, that's a very controversial subject. But again, if we put the humanity label on this, and if you have a man or a woman who is stuck in the wrong body, and if you believe in that, and I think the literature supports that, then it would be arguably cruel and unusual punishment not to alleviate the situation. If they were dying of cancer or another disease, they might not get such good care. So I'd be speculating. I think it's probably from donations, and then the state budget somehow came around with it. It's hard to fully understand that kind of situation if you're not in that situation. But having been a lawyer representing sexual abuse victims who had sexual identity issues as a result of being molested and viciously molested, I can kind of understand that psychology.
At the beginning, you mentioned the percentage of inmates that are on drug-related charges is, I believe, 90%, which is huge, of course. Yeah. And the overcrowding issue has to be correlated immediately to drug-related problems. Right. Do you have any recommendations for how to deal with separating the drug-related rather than the vicious, criminal, violent behavior I think should be incarcerated?
I think there should be separate institutions for people who have drug dependency problems. If you mix them into the general population of other offenders, and what I mean by that are people addicted. When I say 90%, it could be someone who was a burglar that was breaking into a home to get something to sell to support a drug problem for him or herself or for another person. So it's not always they have an addiction problem, but those with addiction problems and the heroin and the cocaine, which is just eating up their minds, there should be special programs. It's like there are criminal courts now, there are domestic relation courts now that have segmented segmented out areas of the law. I think the punishment when you're convicted of a crime and you have a dependency, you should go to a special care unit, prison, to be given the opportunity for rehabilitation. Everyone would benefit, and percentage-wise, I can't tell you how many will be successful, but if it's 10%, it's a great savings for society. And always remember the families that are behind these people. So that would be my recommendation. With a large dose of mental health, social work support, build up their self-esteem. Why are they taking drugs? Why are they self-medicating? I mean, bottom line is they're not happy. And they're not happy why? Well, everybody has their reason. And mental health people that are trained appropriately can help these people. That would be my recommendation.
So you hear about people who are going into prison and they can pay to go to a better place. Maybe Martha Stewart may have paid something, or their training programs. So that may be at the federal level or other states, but here we have nothing like that.
Oh, there's nothing like that in California, and I don't know anything about what you're describing in the federal system. If it does exist, it's not going to be overt. It's going to be through politics and persuasion of other kinds. It's not going to be here's a catalog of how you can pay to elevate your situation. It's going to be
not
subversive.
to elevate it so much, but you pay because you have the funding to take care of yourself during that time, like a Martha Stewart, a billionaire.
Yeah.
We send her to prison. Why should anyone pay for her to be in prison?
It's a question I don't have the answer to because I don't know anything about it, to be honest with you. I'll research it and I'll write a blog about it.
But I do hear about these programs where you get training when you're in prison to learn a certain skill. So it's not here in California, but maybe it's in other states or at the federal level.
It could be in other states.
So we're behind the time.
We're behind the times because we have more people in prison than any other state. Maybe Texas has a few thousand more. And right. And they also execute the most people. What you're doing is you're putting your finger on the pulse of prison reform issues and problems.
Right.
And I'm glad that you're asking that question because it's a legitimate question. I don't know the answer to it, but I'm going to research that. I'm going to see
because
if
not
there's...
everyone is worthless. They make mistakes.
Sure.
And as you said, it could be drug related.
Right.
And to put them in a prison that can help with their drug problem for 3 years may turn them around totally.
Exactly.
And our prison population would just go down tremendously.
I agree with you in theory. I really do. I'd like to see it
it's a good
put
theory,
into practice. I'd love to see it put into practice.
Which is sad.
Yeah.
Mark, I have a question related to drugs. We often think of the drug problem as primarily involving inner city people. But with the acknowledged opioid epidemic that's sweeping the country, people like us who are in pain get overprescribed opioid medications and become involuntary drug addicts and then have to go to cocaine or heroin or something and then do something to break the law to get the money to get the drugs and end up in jail. So one of the perverse effects of the general population getting more and more addicted to opioids will be that more and more of them will be drug offenders and ending up in prison in these conditions that you were describing. And I'm talking about people in our families. So perhaps that's some kind of will create some kind of a change.
I think a model that most people will relate to here are what's happening to our returning veterans and the drug problem, the opiate problem there, who have been administered opiates because of pain, because of war injuries, because of incidents that contributed to their PTSD. And that's a sad case. There are many veterans that I met in prison who that was their track. It started with the military. Military discharged them. It was almost like being released from prison. It's like, you're done, thanks. Here's your severance pay or whatever, and come on back if you want. And the military, it's interesting because these men band together. It's that bond, again, that you see. And the administration respects them more than the general population, but there's still nothing in place for them to deal with their opiate addiction other than cold turkey. And that, I believe, doesn't work. And for civilians, it would be the same thing. It would be the same track. If you're a civilian and you're over-medicated by a doctor, or you shop doctors and you get multiple medications, which the system should not allow, and you end up addicted and then you commit a crime to support your addiction, the prison system, the judicial system doesn't care. They don't care. What they should do is shunt you out of the criminal system and put you into a rehab situation.
I'd like to thank Mark. I don't know if there's any other questions, but we generally break around now. I would like him to tell a very funny anecdote that I think kind of speaks to the whole dehumanization of it. Talk about the mirror.
Oh. I mean...
He didn't know he was gray.
Oh.
He didn't know he had gray hair.
In prison, yeah, I went in at 54 and I had dark hair. In prison, you have to understand there are no toilet covers because you could you could hurt someone. There are no mirrors, and the working title for the book was Stainless Steel Mirrors, and the significance of that is you can see yourself kind of in stainless steel, but over the years, when they're wiped off and cleaned, they're scratchy, and they're you can't see anything, essentially, but there's a mirror. And when I was able to use the bathroom in the library that I talked about so affectionately, they actually had a mirror. And one day I looked up and I went, I saw my father. and so doing time had done me some changes in my appearance, and I also developed a few wrinkles I didn't know I had. But let's just say there was a lot of stress. And
Dementia, I mean, I'm sure you don't have a razor blade, but on that line with no mirrors or anything.
The question, yes. Interestingly enough, and you can also iron your clothes with a regular iron. With a hot iron, with the blacks and the others had their own, and the Mexicans and the whites had their own. But you could do some damage with an iron. It's an imprecise system. But when you're in a lockup and you haven't been processed yet, you can shave, but then there's a count. You know, they make sure all the razors come back. There's a lot of counting going on. They count your head. They count your teeth. Because if you're missing teeth after you've come in, well, how'd you lose your tooth? Well, you're probably in a fight, so they're looking for that kind of evidence. If you cut yourself, I learned you go to the medical office and report it so they can put it in and, you scratch your knuckles, because if there's a fight soon after that, okay, Roseman's been in a fight. So it's a lot of protective work that you have to do to keep yourself from getting into more trouble. So that's my story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For coming. This is great.
Thank you, Ruth.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.